Today we have Derrick Peterson, who is a PhD candidate in history and an adjunct professor of historical theology at Multnomah University and Seminary. He is also a freelance editor and writer, and some of his work can be found at agreatercourage.blogspot.com. His latest book is Flat Earths and Fake Footnotes. Thank you for joining us today, Derrick.
How did a young man like you, get interested in the topic of this book? I'm curious. So Kristine would love to know, all of us would love to know, what's your faith background, your education background? What kind of led you down this path?
Yeah. And Kristine's showing the beautiful cover art that Whippenstock did for me. I was extremely excited when I saw that. It was great. Well, I'm 37, so I'm not maybe as young. I don't know if I look older or younger than that, but I appreciate. Call me young all day. That's great. That's get on my good side here. Yeah. So I grew up as an evangelical. I had that conversion experience or whatever you want to call it when I was 4 or 5. And grew up in a Christian household. And funny enough, though, the faith and science questions have always interested me and kind of always accompanied my journey, I guess you could say. A church we went to a long time ago, I was transitioning, I think, from kindergarten to first grade, and they had this really beautiful tradition of, giving a Bible to the graduates, right? And it was, it had some beautiful illustrations in it. And my favorite story had always been Noah's Ark, and I was also extremely into dinosaurs. And so some of the elders came in, a few other volunteers. They were going with all the individual kids, kind of going through the Bible, looking at the pictures with us, and just kind of having a good time. And I came across the Noah's Ark picture, which had a bunch of dinosaurs drawn in, and this kind of blew my little mind, because I had never. If dinosaurs had been in the story, I would have certainly noticed that. And so my little mind started going, like, what is going on here? Why is there a Brontosaurus or Diplodocus or whatever else dinosaurs were kind of making their way onto the ark? And I caused a bit of a commotion, because my parents had always indulged, my interests, and I had all of these dinosaur encyclopedias, and they would patiently read their taxonomic names like little Latin prayers to me, and I would try my best to repeat them. But all of my books were pretty, on the nose about dinosaurs and humans never coexisting. And my little first grade self made the mistake of kind of bringing that up in a pretty loud way. I started laughing, and I said, dinosaurs, died billions of years ago. They weren't on the ark. They're not in the story. And it was kind of one of those record scratch moments, right, where it's, some of the other kids kind of perked up a little bit. Some of the elders started going apoplectic, and my dad got a talking to, after that, like, well, what has your kid been reading, kind of thing. So in its own way, I guess that was kind of foreshadowing. Faith and science has just always been in the background. I have a fairly eclectic set of tastes. I've always enjoyed reading. It's kind of always been my favorite pastime, and God kind of blessed me with being a quick reader with a pretty decent retention rate. So, but weirdly enough, so I went. This is too long-winded, so I'll wrap it up a little bit. So I ended up going to seminary. So I have undergraduate degrees in New Testament with kind of a focus on textual criticism, and I have a second major in Koine Greek or Kine Greek, depending on the pronunciation. And then I ended up getting a Master's of Divinity in Theological Studies and a second Master's focused on the historical aspects of kind of systematic theology and historical theology kind of together. And right now I'm working on a PhD at the University of Texas, and I actually am probably switching programs. They really insist on me moving down there, and I have a nice job here that they're going to make me quit, and I'm just not super keen on that considering the job market right now. So I'm trying to figure things out. But that's me in a nutshell. I've really, the interesting thing with this book specifically is that though faith and science has always accompanied me, the notion of their history, it wasn't really a question that I tackled head on until my very last class in seminary. I needed some elective credits. And Dr. Mike Gurney, who's one of my friends and mentors, said, "Hey, we should look at the history of faith and science." And, so we picked up a few books by some of the bigger names in the area: John Hedley Brooke, Peter Harrison, David Livingston, Edward Grant does some medieval stuff. And I was expecting, to have a few nuggets kind of in my back pocket for when I would talk to like an atheist or even, an evangelical Christian who, thought that science was always anti-Christian or whatever. But what I really discovered in that class was an enormous, almost an embarrassment of riches in terms of the historical work specifically that's been going on. And I think a lot of the literature that Christians tend to encounter is asking the very relevant question of, well, what is the relationship today between faith and science? But the history of the relationship is always more or less, it's kind of passed by quickly. And even at that later stage of my education, I had sort of assumed that it was a fairly ignominious history, right? That we screwed up a lot and we needed to kind of get our act together. Christians believed in a flat earth. They burned the Library of Alexandria, et cetera, et cetera. I grew up watching Cosmos with Carl Sagan and, all these programs that kind of had those little, misunderstood nuggets of history there. So, but yeah, I really came in that class to become obsessed because for the last 50 years or so, and that's kind of part of what I wanted to do in my book is tell this to people who might not otherwise get a chance. There's really been a huge sea change in how even secular, quote unquote, secular historians of science have really dealt with the issue. And so the warfare model has not only been overturned, it's actually actively held up as kind of how not to do history. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. I was really surprised that this wealth of literature doesn't show up more, even in Christian apologetics, which I'm not necessarily sure is the most appropriate place for it necessarily, but I think there's a lot that can be done. Yeah, so that's kind of how I arrived here. After seminary, I was sort of off again, on again. Do I want to do a PhD? The market's so terrible. Do I really want to do this? So to kind of fill my time, I started on a few research projects, and one of them happened to be, it ended up being this book. So yeah, so here we are.
So, okay, tell us about your book, Flat Earths and Fake Footnotes. Are you going to use this material in your PhD, and who's the target audience, and what's your main message? Who would be the most interested in reading this?
Yeah. So some of it may end up in my PhD research. This book is really targeted to a more general audience, be it kind of lay Christians who are interested in the faith and science questions, but may not have a lot of time to investigate on their own. And even non-believers, people who have either fallen away from the faith because they feel that science is one of the major hurdles that they weren't able to overcome. So yeah, my target really is kind of a more general rather than an academic audience. But that being said, as I mentioned, I was actually really surprised how little of this material has made its way into explicitly theological or even apologetic discussions. And so I try to attain a balance of writing in such a way that the narrative itself was compelling for people who weren't otherwise interested in academic work, but that the footnotes and the bibliography would provide enough for people who work at a more professional level in these areas who may not have taken the deep dive in this area per se. So yeah, general audience for sure, but I suppose kind of have an eye on academics who might be interested in getting deeper into the history of faith and science. So
Derrick, it sounds like you went into this probably with a different, it sounds like you grew as you were writing this book, or your understanding of what it was going to be changed as you wandered upon evidence that maybe you weren't expecting. What was your view going in? Did you presuppose that there was actual what do you call it, the warfare model, and and how did that view change as you were studying this topic?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In a nutshell, I didn't think the warfare thesis per se was accurate. However, some of the more famous set pieces like Galileo, I hadn't ever really looked into it. And so while at a systematic level, I thought that science and faith, or science and theology were completely compatible, I did think that through history, there was certainly more than our fair share of screw ups in that area where we at least needed to learn from it, and perhaps even repent for some of the craziness that went on. And certainly Christianity is, I'm not trying to paint a blameless, spotless picture here, far from it. But I think one of the major areas of growth is just how much misinformation circulated around these topics, even the seemingly open and shut cases like Galileo, like the 1925 Scopes trial, that on the surface seems so obviously to be this clash between science and Christianity. On further reflection, they turn out to be much more complicated, and sometimes actually having very little to do with faith and science per se once you dive into the surface. And I'm sure we'll come to it, but a lot of this comes about through changes in methodology, changes in perspective too. There's a lot of presuppositions that go into it. And if we go into it wanting to find a conflict between faith and science, it's very easy to construct that picture. Ultimately, it's not, I think, an accurate picture at all, but it can be created. And I think that's part of the reason it has such staying power is because people today don't have a large attention span. And if you get a few bullet points in there, yeah, it does look like Galileo was persecuted for his science. Yeah, it does look like the Scopes trial was, about fundamentalism, fundamentally rejecting science, or whatever. So, but yeah, my growth in that area was really, I think, kind of, it really, I almost can't overstress this. My mind was really, really blown. Especially about how some of our categories of what science is, of what religion is, came to be deconstructed, because those categories do a lot of heavy lifting when in fact they're the very things that are in need of historical justification, in order to be presented as causal agencies, as actors that are doing things in history. And once we kind of put those anachronistic categories behind us and look at what the actors themselves thought that they were doing, the contexts that go along with that, a really fascinating world, and sometimes alien, sometimes familiar, really opens up. But it's certainly much more exciting, I think, than some of the black and white binaries that we all have kind of been indoctrinated into.
Yeah, isn't that true of just about every topic, though? As soon as you start scratching beneath the surface, there's so much more complexity and nuance. And I mean, that's just life.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Definitely true. I mean, above all, I almost have come to hate the cliche that everything you know is wrong. I think it kind of becomes a trite marketing campaign, but with the history of faith and science, it really, one does wish we could almost hit the restart button, because it's people who know a little bit are almost more dangerous than people who come in admitting that they know very little, because our presuppositions very quickly send us down some of these well-worn paths, and we end up, I think, repeating some of the less helpful variations of history. So,
So part of this reminds me of an actual relationship, and we stand here and maybe we're the children of two divorced parents, and we're not given to believe that they ever loved each other. And what you're telling us is, there was a love story, there was a romance. So I'm going to ask you in a little bit, and then how did it come to this? Where did it go off the rails? If it did go off the rails, are we simply talking about smoke and mirrors? But I don't want to ask that now because I know I'm getting ahead of Kristine. So Kristine, walk us into that, but that'll be coming there. Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Well, so chapter 2 begins with a quote from Tom Holland. And I have a teenager who, kind of is a Tom Holland fan. But we're talking not the Tom Holland who did Spider-Man, right? This is a different
No. That would be something.
Yeah.
Right. So profound has been the impact of Christianity on the development of Western civilization that it has come to be hidden from view. So what do you think the not Spider-Man Tom Holland meant by that?
Yeah, that's a real money quote. And for any of your viewers who haven't had a chance to pick up his book Dominion, it's really, really fantastic. It's another attempt of kind of overturning some of what we thought we knew about the history of Christianity. That quote, in a nutshell, I think embodies a lot of what I am trying to do with my book. And what I think he means by it is that Christianity has, in fact, been so influential on us that things that we take to be kind of common sense, everyday items are actually the historical byproduct of how Christianity has shaped life, especially in the West. Although in the East as well, there's arguments to be made there. But it's so one of the problems I think that often comes up is our assumption really shapes what we think Christianity is, and so we tend to use common sense against Christianity per se, or certain forms of reasoning against Christianity, certain forms of morality against Christianity. Or we try to take them on their own as if they were able to operate independently. But in fact, when one attacks it from a kind of a historical genealogical perspective, these are the byproducts of kind of Christianity's complex interaction with the history of the West. And it's arguable that many of these constructs, say human rights, for example, wouldn't have been able to exist should Christianity have not bequeathed that, into our habits, into our thoughts. We have to be a little careful there. The what if Christianity never existed is, obviously at one level it's an impossible question to answer. But a lot of our philosophy and our science and just our economics, our politics, our ways of organizing life, we often see them as secular and fundamentally independent from Christianity, when in fact these are the sons and daughters of a Christian legacy. They were often incubated within a broadly theological understanding of the world that incorporated these as elements, say economics or politics, but through a complicated story, more and more became seen as independent of it. And so, as often happens, the children then rebelled against the parents, so to speak. But I think what Tom Holland is trying to point out, and what I'm also trying to point out in the book, is that we don't necessarily need to make Christianity relevant to the culture, because from a particular historical angle, Christianity is always already there, for better or worse. And it's, I think, our duty to remember that, to kind of summon it from its slumber in corners of life that we don't often associate with theology or religion anymore. And I think that that's really powerful, because we have a tendency, in this story, the warfare story, there's a tendency to paint Christianity as fundamentally irrational or fideistic, or just insane in some instances. And the baseline for that is everything that we take for granted today that is so-called secular reason. And I think that Holland is pointing at something really powerful that happens when we realize actually Christianity had a major hand in all of these, and certainly things have undergone mutations. They've changed over the years, but there is not this irrational Christianity on the one hand, and then sort of the rational secular life on the other. These clear-cut distinctions really start to become very hazy and interconnected as we sort of look at the historical record and put aside some of our more cliche and anachronistic categories that, like I mentioned, they have been doing just way too much heavy lifting for us from a historical standpoint.
Maybe since you've brought it up a couple of times now, maybe you could define for us what you mean by the warfare thesis, and how did it, what gave birth to it, and why do you think it sticks so well, at least maybe not like you're saying right now with the actual historical academics, but with lay people? Why is that, I think, the default setting of modern presumption?
Yeah, that's a huge question. And as far as its sociological components, I don't get into all of it. But the basic argument of my book is that the warfare thesis. So, in a nutshell, the warfare thesis is simply saying that Christianity and science have perennially, almost since the dawn of time, kind of been opposed. Right? Christians, they burned down the Library of Alexandria. They persecuted and killed Hypatia of Alexandria, the female philosopher. They condemned Galileo. They burned Servetus at the stake for, while John Calvin was giggling as he looked on, and on and on and on. So that the warfare thesis in a nutshell is a historically driven idea that, Christianity has just always been at odds with the sciences, and the sciences are often painted as almost a Robin Hood figure, this heroic underdog that finally managed to escape its captors and create the much more egalitarian and sanitary life that we have today. So in a nutshell, one of the interesting things is Christianity has, of course, always had its cultured detractors, but the warfare thesis per se only really began to arise in the 18th and 19th centuries. And a major argument of my book is that what happened, to cut a very long and complicated story short, is that, quite interestingly, the idea of the warfare thesis happened to coincide in its birth with the birth of history as a professional university discipline. And these, again, happen to coincide with the debates over the reception of Darwinism and evolutionary theory at large. And so what happened really is that a mirage takes place, in the sense that because a certain group of people who were the first professional historians had a particular view of things, and why they had that, we can get to that in a moment. Because the fact that they were working with history, they very easily created these stories that gave the illusion of this long pedigree of warfare, when in fact it was quite a new invention in many instances. And it was new not just in the sense of being wrong in many instances, but a lot of the categories that were being used, like what a religion is and what science is, came to reshape history into their images. And when we have a particular notion of science and particular notion of religion as we tend to use them today, when you stamp an episode like the Galileo affair with those categories, it becomes more or less clear cut that, Galileo is on one side, apparently representing this category of science, and the Catholic Church is obviously on the other side, representing religion. But one of the deconstructions that's really happened is to say that these categories actually, not only are they historically specific, so they only take effect, in mid-19th century per se. Once we dissolve them, science and religion start showing up on all of our previously clear-cut sides, in very curious intermixtures, or what we would today kind of see as intermixtures. And so the warfare thesis really got started with several key individuals in the 19th century, like Thomas Huxley and Andrew Dixon White and John William Draper. And each of them had their own kind of particular personal and institutional beefs that drove a lot of what they saw as the warfare thesis. So they had a tendency to kind of project their own individual circumstances and drape it over all of history, and reshape it into their image. So Christianity, in fact, shaped science in very major ways, but these men had a hand in how we receive these histories, and from there, through the new profession of history, an entire generation or two of academics were trained in these categories that really helped perpetuate the myth. And in fact, they were just trained explicitly in the myth itself, which sort of migrated from these very overtly polemical textbooks into more this kind of dry textbook era in kind of the 1950s America, right? So what was openly polemical sort of became kind of this is how it's always been textbook-ish type of knowledge. Very unassuming, very kind of, this is the way things were. So it's certainly not the only way that the warfare thesis took off. There's a lot of other angles that we could explore. But the angle I'm really trying to explore is how the arguments around the reception of Darwin and really the emergence of history as a professional university discipline both kind of aided and abetted this universal idea that Christianity and science have always been kind of at loggerheads with one another.
Would it be fair to say then that what your book sets out to do is debunk the myth that there's been a hot war between faith and science, and in doing so, you uncovered evidence that there is a war between history and faith?
That's a very interesting way of putting it. I would be a little hesitant, just because history as a category too, once you get into the nuts and bolts, that was also a theologically driven category, even in the areas of higher criticism. But as a general rule of thumb, it's very interesting that we tend to assume that science was the main antagonist, excuse me, when in fact it's really been history as the discipline that has been kind of the major player in trying to not necessarily debunk Christianity, but certainly overturn some of the more usual assumptions, whether it be the verbal plenary inspiration of Scripture, or the timeline that we of 6,000 years, or what have you. So I wouldn't necessarily want to put it in quite black and white terms, but I think that it's definitely getting us into the right ballpark to say, look, actually, it's really history that we need to start looking at. In fact, science was so Michael Buckley, who is a Catholic historian, has this great line in his book on the origins of atheism, and he says it amuses him when he sees so many people talking about the warfare of Christianity and science, and he said actually it's the exact opposite. Part of the problem was that Christianity was so intimately fused with the variety of the sciences that when those sciences happened to change, it looked like the Christianity so closely wedded to them also became defunct. So history really is, I think, the driving factor here. And there's a lot of surprises along the way once we kind of shift the lens there.
Well, I'd love to talk specifically about some of the examples that most people believe are evidences of a hot war. You brought up Galileo, Copernicus, possibly, Bruno, definitely Darwin and the Scopes trial. So maybe we can come to those. But let me ask you this. As a tail follow-up to the question we just kind of jumped into, and that is that history has had more effect on perpetuating the idea of the warfare thesis, and that is, do you think that the men you mentioned, Draper, White, Huxley, do you think their motivation, and I'm not asking you to climb into their minds, and I know you do some of this in your book, but is their motivation a resentment that at the time that science and faith were wedded, did they resent the power relationship that faith had? or that the church
Yeah, that's yes. I think the quick and dirty answer is I think that there was certainly some of that. This quickly gets complicated because, again, like you said, we can't necessarily crawl into their heads. But Thomas Huxley, for example, was a very able individual, incredibly smart, incredibly good at the new discipline of the sciences. So scientist as a term and as a category wasn't coined until 1832 by an Anglican, William Whewell. And so, but Huxley was continuously denied work because he wasn't a Christian. And during the reign of Anglicanism, you often had to sign confessions of faith or adhere to certain dogmatic ideas. And, Huxley, I think to his credit, wouldn't bend his own morals to do that. And so he was actually, often very, very upset about how often he had been denied work, right? And so in many ways, he came to his animosity against the theologians, quite honestly, even if it wasn't a straightforward science versus religion set piece. Because one of the interesting twists that happens with actually every one of the figures that I talk about in my book and at large is none of them think that religion and science conflict. All of them are specifically attacking theology instead of religion. And that actually turns out to be a fairly important principle that we can get into later here. But yeah, there is a certain animosity about the power structures that were going on because the Anglican Church very often did control, if not what was said, certainly who could be saying it. And so, yeah, I think that the idea of looking at the new emerging professional class of scientists, often among whom were Christians aplenty, wanting a sort of occupational independence from the oversight of the Anglican Church, who, frankly, had no real business, looking over the shoulder when they themselves were not scientists. And so one of the major reworkings of the Warfare Thesis is that it was not a clash between science and religion, but it was very often the emergence of a new it was a clash between a younger professional elite and the older established professional elite of the Anglican clergy. And so even just with this slight twist, it really dismantles the Warfare Thesis because on all sides we have Christians and on all sides we have agnostics. And so it's not really that religion is seen as opposing science or science as opposing religion. It's kind of it's a power grab in a real way. It's about establishing an occupational independence, and for people like Huxley not to need to sign a statement of faith before they get their test tubes out, so to speak.
So it seems like in the past, theology was the queen of all scientific disciplines, but now it's like theology is either completely divorced from science or completely perverted in order to conflict with science. What's the story of how that came to be? How did history and theology kind of become divorced like that?
Yeah. Again, it's another very complicated story. So I always hesitate. I always want to get the disclaimer that this is, unanswered to it. There's always different viewpoints, different ways of approaching the topic. But so one of the I think clarifications here is theology as the queen of the sciences it's a really interesting phenomenon, but it wasn't quite as prevalent, I think, as we often assumed it was. In the medieval university system, very few people actually ended up having to study theology because it was seen as essentially one of the capstones. It was like getting a doctorate. And so medicine, theology, and law were kind of the next stage of education, whereas most people who are just kind of going through, I suppose, what we call undergraduate education would be learning the trivium and the quadrivium, so like arithmetic and music and geometry and all that. And so theology, as the queen of the sciences, we have to be a little careful, because I think we often picture the medieval period as theology is just calling all of the shots here, kind of in an almost deductive top-down manner. And without getting too much into the woods here, that's not necessarily the case. There's a very strong tradition of naturalism in medieval theology and philosophy, often based on theological premises, more or less. The idea that God created a system that was coherent, that was stable on its own, that didn't often need his interference, so to speak. But part of the story that I tell about, what happened to theology, because obviously it's not exactly a glamorous discipline anymore. That's kind of part and parcel of, amongst many things, of the emerging professionalization debates. The idea was, in the new definition of the scientist, it was really attempting to distance itself from prior ideas of natural philosophy, I suppose we should say. We often, for example, think of Isaac Newton as one of the first scientists, and that's often how he's represented in some of the typical stories. But Isaac Newton wouldn't have thought of himself as a scientist, if for no other reason than the word didn't exist. When he was writing his Principia Mathematica, it's in the title of the book, he thought he was doing natural philosophy, which, as he very openly says, involves such ideas as God's relationship to the world. And so in the emerging professionalization debates in the Victorian period, one of the ideas was that theology really needed to stay over there, right? It wasn't that theology opposed the sciences. It was simply that more and more it was seen that the scientific knowledge required a type of specialization that was no longer possible if people were getting education across the board in like 7 different disciplines, right? So part of this professionalization debate was kind of a territory debate. It was a drawing lines in the sand, and it was kind of making theology stand outside of that circle. But again, this is often Christians themselves who are calling the shots here. So this isn't some atheist or agnostic campaign to throw theology out into the cold. But what happens, and one of the major aspects of the book that I focus upon, is a group of individuals who made up what they called themselves the X Club, which sort of sounds like some supervillain team or something. Thomas Huxley was one of their leaders, and he's often referred to as Darwin's bulldog because he was his hype man. He was really responsible for spreading the word about Darwinism. And interestingly enough, he was also very influential in spinning Darwin and evolutionary theory in an anti-theistic, agnostic direction. So part of the story here is, again, I think we typically hear that, theology was pushed out by the sciences. It was conquered by the sciences, that theology was sort of a proto-science that ended up showing itself being deficient, that God was sort of a proto-explanation that, again, showed itself to be deficient when the gaps in nature began closing and God kind of was out of a job. But that's not at all what happened. Without getting into too many of those details, what did happen is, so we tend to think of naturalism as anti-theology, as anti-theistic. If we talk about a methodological naturalism in the sciences, that is, fundamentally atheistic. But as I mentioned earlier, actually, there was a very strong tradition of naturalism justified theologically from the medieval period on. But what happens in these professionalization debates is Thomas Huxley and others who were at the origin of history as a university discipline began writing and rewriting the histories of the emergence of science. And where methodological naturalism, or naturalism as a whole, the ideas of laws of nature, nature as a seamless continuum of cause and effect that humankind has the ability to investigate and understand, these were almost without fail theologically justified. The idea that the human was made in the image of God meant that our mind and the world were able to reflect one another. We should expect a rational order to nature because God is a rational lawgiver. But what Huxley ended up doing, very slyly, is rewriting these histories in such a way that they became, they seem to always have been purely the provenance of the agnostic, if not the atheist. And so more and more theology was quite literally written out of these histories, where it had in fact been playing a major role. And that's a pretty huge theme of my book. I call it deleting theology. So in these historical reconstructions of the history of science, where theology and where religion played major roles, whether it's kind of in the ambient culture that in shaping our presuppositions of what is possible, or whether specific theological conclusions were shaping research trajectories, people like Huxley more and more sort of tweak the narrative just so theology no longer showed up in the stories. Isaac Newton becomes the first scientist instead of seeing his Principia Mathematica as a fairly elaborate proof for the existence of God, right? It becomes nothing more than a physics treatise. Adam Smith, seen as the first in the line of scientific economics, was actually writing in the genre of theodicy, and was writing theological treatises that then became The Wealth of Nations, and his other works leading into capitalist economic theory and the like. Even Darwin was working in a broadly natural theological environment, and many of his presuppositions, many of his conclusions about what adaptation was and how it functioned, granted they were inversions of William Paley's design arguments, but they still often, even explicitly in The Origin of Species, involved theological argumentation. And part of the sea change that's really happened amongst historians is realizing how part and parcel theology was in the rise of these sciences, to the extent that The Origin of Species has been called, quite shockingly, to be the last example of Victorian natural theology. But what happens again and again by people like Huxley, because this is at the beginning of history as a university discipline, theology is cut out, and not always for dark reasons of anti-Christianity, because at some level, if you're writing a history of economics, you only have time to write so much, right? You're writing a history of physics, you only have time for so much. Writing about Anselm's ontological proof seems a bit beside the point in certain cases. So for both anti-theological, anti-Christian reasons and more benign, pragmatic reasons, Christianity and theology and religion more and more became cut out of the picture. And so with that happening, and with these major set pieces like Galileo and the Scopes affair, where religion and science seem to be clashing, we get this sort of reorganized history of where religion has been nothing but a bane to the sciences, because all of its positive contributions have been cut out, and the only things that are left are sort of these misunderstood set pieces that show them to be at each other's throats. So that's kind of the quick and dirty. So it's really an act of historical writing that has more and more made it a sort of gut reaction, a habit of how intellectuals approach those histories. But in the last 50 years or so, this has really been overturned a lot.
So I want to talk about that, but part of me wants to go back to Galileo and part of me wants to go forward a little bit. And I'm going to start with the forward since we're on that topic right now. And that's the idea that that Huxley and you're putting kind of ground zero around Darwin, right? Because you're saying Huxley and the others began to
some
revise history. Would you say revise history or form it in their own image around that time? What makes it stick? I mean, is it all smoke and mirrors, or is there something to it that they had a foothold that they could, use in a way that's going to make it stick going forward? So that's my first question. And the second question is, in that time, you could point to Huxley, Draper, and White as you have, but is there a portion of Christianity today that accepts that view of this fissure between faith and science, and even builds on that distrust?
Yeah. So to your first question, why does it stick? It's a hard question to answer, but Huxley and the X Club, for one, they were quite ingenious about how they went about things. I mean, their people were everywhere. Their major goal was to really take over the university system. And Andrew Dixon White was kind of part of this as well. And so they put their people in key places. But part of the professionalization of science was saying more and more that, we don't need to bring explicitly theological propositions or ideas or argumentations or interpretations into the lab with us, so to speak. It doesn't talk about their validity one way or the other. It's merely saying we don't need them at a pragmatic level, even if at the end of the day, when, we're talking about the sciences to our friends and to people at the church, it can be part of a more elaborate theological treatise. So at one level, it sticks for purely practical reasons. The sciences became, I think, so successful because they limited the areas more and more that they were looking at. And I think one of the problems today is that, communicators like Richard Dawkins tend to turn science and move it away from the limited areas where it's been so successful and kind of almost turn it into a philosophy or an omnicompetent, methodology. But it sticks in part simply because so many people who are becoming scientists, Christians, again, part and parcel of this movement, are attempting to say we don't need to have the oversight of the church here in the university system to make these things functional. Like they still work just fine. And it was for a variety of other reasons, key cultural moments, again, with Christians on all sides. This isn't atheists versus Christians or agnostics versus Christians. There were key cultural moments that happened that I explore a few of them in my book, where certain separations were more or less inevitable. The Catholic Church was on high alert because of some really horrible stuff that had went down with Napoleon, and so it was circling the wagons. So without getting into too much of the trees, I think it stuck because of certain key cultural situations where it was theology was less and less tolerated as part of the scientific discipline. And in many ways, I think the churches had really sort of their cultural capital was running empty for one reason or another. This didn't necessarily have anything to do with the sciences, but that's how the story ended up being told. It really, some of the animosity that was sometimes rightly raised, for example, Huxley, again, not getting a job, or people who had been previously persecuted by the church who felt very wrongly, put out. A lot of this became channeled into the new vocabulary of the sciences, even when it had very, very little to do with it. I don't talk about this in my book, but one Victorian scholar talks a lot about how Christianity was really it became synonymous or with terms of maturity growing up. From it really picked up on Paul's metaphors of youth moving into maturity and adulthood. And one of the weird fallouts of this in the Victorian period was that, like all children do, they tend to rebel against their parents. And because Christianity was seen as such a part of kind of the nuclear family and the cultural heritage of the Victorian era, the youth rebellions that were going on necessarily saw Christianity as one of the objects of scorn, right? And so you have just a variety of different cultural moments like that may or may have not have anything to do with science, right? But then get expressed in terms of the new vocabulary of the sciences, because the sciences are also becoming more and more tied to kind of this broad morality of maturity, of courage, of standing up for oneself. And so you get a host of different rebellions that were kind of trying to express themselves in the vocabulary of science, and that was getting written into the history textbooks. But again, when you kind of press past the surface, there's all sorts of other things that are going on, and it's not science versus faith at all, though many chose to express it in those terms in order to kind of justify the cultural moment that they are at. And the second question was
the corner. Is there a corner of the Christian faith today that actually accepts the warfare thesis and embraces it and perpetuates it?
Yeah, that's one of the ironies of fundamentalism is it, I think, took the positivist types of sciences for granted and simply said that Christianity could do it better. But in so doing, I think they sort of took for granted a lot of how the story was being told more and more by people like Thomas Huxley. And they simply said that, science, mainstream science, does oppose Christianity. It's that Christianity can do real, quote unquote, real science better. So there is, I think, a real sense in which this mythology of a warfare that didn't exist quite ironically becomes incarnated by people who replicate it now. These days, the creationist versus evolutionist type of ideas, there's a lot more going on than simple faith versus science, I think. But in many ways, it's almost become a parody of the parody. And it's really sad too, because it's just really sad to see people go down that road. But again, a lot of it is based on the historical presuppositions that then shape and kind of ballast our constructive judgments. And I think I think there are certainly aspects of Christianity today that have imbibed that idea. But on the other hand, there is a sense in which, if you look at the level of influence that people like Huxley had in how they rewrote history to kind of cut the theistic and theological portions out, it's not black and white there either. There has been some finagling of the historical record here that is more and more becoming uncovered. So I think, again, it's history really that we're dealing with more than it is faith and science.
Well, let me ask this one more question. I'll let Kristine, because I know she wants to jump on positivism, which you just mentioned. But let's talk about that history a little bit. You brought up a few chapters in that history that Huxley used and that others have used to paint the warfare thesis. Walk us through a few of these and tell us where that default story is wrong or is maybe a caricature. For example, you brought up Servetus. You didn't mention Bruno, but we could talk about Bruno. So Servetus was killed, and he wasn't killed because he was a horse thief, right? Same thing with Bruno. Bruno was not a child molester, and he was put to death. So, I mean, there are some things people can point to. Galileo, it was a nice villa, but he was he was under house arrest, and his works were suppressed. So walk us through what was true and what's not true of possibly the Galileo episode, and maybe even the Scopes trial, if we can get there. If that's too big of a jump, I'll let Kristine interrupt us.
That's a lot, but yeah, that's great. I think so. Before we jump into specifics of either of those episodes, I think it's important to talk a little bit about some of the methodological changes that have happened that are really driving what I call the quiet revolution in the historiography of faith and science, or Christianity and science more specifically. So a lot of work by people like Thomas Huxley, Andrew Dixon White, John William Draper, the gang that I kind of talk about in my book, is their variations of history get a lot of work done because of how their categories are creating the pictures that they want to be created. So part of the story here is that we tend to use faith or religion and science in very preset ways, as we can almost picture them as two circles that kind of everything within the circle is describing that part of the world, be it the scientific world or be it the religious world. And one of the changes that I've mentioned a little bit that's really happened is looking at how those categories are themselves very, very historically driven. They're not trans-historical, trans-contextual norms that simply exist throughout history, but are themselves created. And what happens is when we notice that actually applying these categories to past events involves us in a very deep-set anachronism, those clear-cut categories begin to dissolve. And we might say that science and theology start showing up on all sides of our previously clear-cut binaries. And so that's a really important first step, because even at that really basic move, religion versus science starts to break down, because we don't actually have clear-cut categories to create that opposition. And so what happens is, if we look at the Galileo affair with these new optics, so to speak, and we drop for the moment how we typically use science and we typically use religion, it actually turns out that what was going on at this level was theology and science in harmony at different levels, but variations of those opposed to one another. So these are variations of theology, combinations of theology and science going against one another in order to theoretically, at the end of the day, produce the one right answer of how theology and science relate. So Galileo and the church is not a story of theology versus science. It's a story of theology and science in various levels of cooperation and interpenetration on all sides. Galileo had his own way of involving theology and the sciences. The church and the various chapters of the church, the Jesuits, the Dominicans, they all had their own different ways of combining these things. And when you look at it from that lens, it's kind of like looking through a prism, right? It sort of starts breaking up a lot of these blocked categories, and it turns out that things are actually a lot more nuanced. And this opens up a lot of strange avenues that we have previously overlooked. Because one,
can I jump in here? Are you basically saying that the Catholic Church at the time, it wasn't that they were anti-science, it's just that they were pro-accepted science, right?
Exactly right. Yeah. I think that's a nice cut and dry way of putting it. Because even one of the major components of this story is the Jesuits being on Galileo's side for a long time, while the Dominicans, being the more conservative branch of the church, with putting forward a very Aristotelian idea of the sciences, was against how Galileo was doing things. And this really opens up some avenues that we tend to overlook when we stamp it with our kind of broad categories of science versus theology, because for example, one of the things that Galileo was doing was elevating the mathematical sciences to such a level that they could actually describe to us the physical layout of the cosmos. To Aristotle, this was a mind-blowing category error, right? So, but already we're not really in the domain of theology versus science here. We're actually talking about Aristotelian science versus whatever we might want to call what Galileo is doing. Because the idea that mathematics could describe the physical layout of a system was unheard of. It was an absolute taboo amongst the quote unquote scientists of the day. And so that seems like a very strange dilemma to us today. But when we kind of look past our typical categories, we start to see that was one of the major issues that was going on. Another issue too was the idea of the level of certainty that one had to have in order for a demonstration to have obtained. And Galileo himself put on himself an Aristotelian level of certainty, which means that not only did he have a probabilistic demonstration, he had to essentially prove that it was deductively necessary for the sun to be in the center of the universe. That's a very, very high level, probably an impossible level of demonstration. And one of the interesting things that has arisen through this revisionary scholarship lately is that, I think we all tend to assume that, well, Galileo was right. He proved the sun was in the center, and the church, for whatever reason, either they were belligerent or, they had their own reasons, they denied the truth of his demonstration. But shockingly enough, by his own standards, Galileo actually did not prove that the sun was in the center of our solar system, or actually the universe, to use the terms of the day. And I'm not arguing here for geocentrism, obviously, but the church didn't. They had a long-standing, predictively successful theory in the Ptolemaic theory. And one of the myths that attended that is that the Ptolemaic theory was falling apart by this stage, and that Galileo and others were coming in and saying, look, we have this better alternative theory. We don't need, this Ptolemaic theory that had all of these ad hoc hypotheses added to it to kind of save it. It was actually still a very vital, successful theory. There's a book out, I think it's called Against All Authority, and its author is escaping me at the moment. But what it does is a very in-depth demonstration of the scientific movements against Copernicus and Galileo in the day. They had very, very good reasons, based on their own standards, for not believing that Galileo or Copernicus demonstrated heliocentrism, because what it turns out is that actually heliocentrism was kind of this elegant act of insight that was based on a series of kind of anti-Ptolemaic arguments that probably deconstructed the Ptolemaic system, or certainly made it rethink things. One of the results of this book that I just mentioned, Against All Authority, is it shows how flexible Ptolemaic theory actually was. It could actually bring into itself a lot of the new observations that were going on and sort of salvage things, as scientific theories have a tendency to do. But be that as it may, so what happens here is that Galileo actually didn't prove heliocentrism, but he had placed upon himself a deductive level of certainty as a necessary prerequisite to, for example, changing how one read scripture. Galileo himself said, look, if we have these passages of scripture that perhaps could be read in a geocentric manner, we would need this deductive level of certainty in order to change our interpretation. And so he failed by his own standards, which is, it's very peculiar, because that's certainly not how we were taught history. And it wasn't heliocentrism versus geocentrism either, as a clear-cut binary of choices. We had Tycho Brahe's geoheliocentric model, which was constantly infuriating for Galileo because from an observational standpoint, actually indistinguishable from Galileo's own system. And so Brahe's idea was that the Earth still retains its place at the center, with the sun orbiting around the Earth, but then all the other planets orbit around the sun. And like I just said, actually, observationally, based on all of the observations that Galileo was making, it was these two views were indistinguishable, right? And so this isn't actually a theological push against Galileo. It's part of the scientific vocabulary of the day that they still have a predictively successful theory. Owen Gingrich, who is emeritus astronomer at Harvard and the Smithsonian, kind of went back and looked at these Ptolemaic star charts, and he used Copernicus's star charts to kind of compare their accuracy. And astoundingly enough, they're actually fairly similar. Copernicus did some things better, and the Ptolemaic system did some things better. So it's not this black and white choice between a theologically loaded system and a purely scientific system, but it's a very complex interplay between different standards and different goals. And of course, different personalities clashing with Galileo and the Pope. And so the story just kind of complexifies from there. It's fascinating. The literature is endless on it if anyone wants to investigate it.
Just before I hand the baton to Kristine, I think, is this the book you're talking about, Setting Aside All Authority?
Yes.
Okay. By
Christopher Graney. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so, it's an excellent work. Does a very good job of showing kind of the scientific the scientific atmosphere, but still that was often in dialogue with theology. We can't really make a black and white distinction there, but it does a very, very good job of overturning some of what we thought we knew of what scientific culture was, what theological culture was back in the day.
So, as I listened to you today and as I was reading your book, and I think with each story, with each character, with each period of time, we see there's so much more complexity and nuance than what has maybe been handed down and or simplified, or the cliff notes that we end up learning, which of course there has to be, right? There is no way we could as people learn every detail and nuance of every situation throughout history, or every discipline of science or literature or anything like that. So there must necessarily be simplification. And I think it's also human nature just to kind of put things in simple categories and to make dichotomies. It's either this or that. And we have to do that in order to process all the information that we have. And right now, the information available to us is just endless. You can Google any subject and learn more than you could ever possibly learn about it. So how do we help people recognize that we're doing that, right? Recognize we're putting things into dichotomies, and most likely these are false dichotomies because it's more nuanced and complex than these simple Cliff Note ideas. And how do we move the story forward so that we don't continue to propagate unhelpful dichotomies?
Yeah, that is, well, I think that's the money question right there. I don't know if there is a more important question than that. It's like Alfred North Whitehead said, until we decide the relationship between science and religion, we're deciding our future essentially when we decide their relationship, is the nutshell of his quote. I think, I obviously think, since I wrote a book this way, for me, when I've been teaching these things, I think for whatever reason, myself included, I think we all have this hunger for the category of kind of misunderstood history. The idea that we're all sort of Indiana Jones, sort of excavating this, the Da Vinci Code, I think is paradoxically a very good example of how we can kind of couch some of these terms, even though obviously the Da Vinci Code itself is not exactly accurate history. I think at some level we all get really excited when we get to not only learn a fact, but we kind of get to, excuse my language, we get to be bastards about it and kind of hold it over and like, hey, look, I know something and everyone else is wrong. And to temper that a little bit, the way that I have tried to present this information is kind of, in overturning myths of history. And I've found that the historical approach is full at sort of circumventing a lot of the, I think, the preset taboos that so easily and quickly shut down a conversation from whatever side. With my 6-day creationist friends, I grew up a 6-day creationist. And as soon as you start to mention deep time, that shuts down the conversation. But if you start going through, say, the so-called hexameral tradition of church commentary and look at how complicated and how diverse the opinions were on not only what Genesis meant, but what the important final goals of our reading of Genesis even are, it starts to, I think, soften some of the hard designations that we all have. And so I don't have a perfect solution for it. But I think taking one or two examples and sort of, I guess, beta testing to see how successful they are in a group, and kind of using them to go from there and expand our horizons is, for me, it's been relatively successful. I think the flat Earth, I mean, that's why I designated it as the title. I think it's such an interesting example, not only because it's such a strange and striking image, but it has a really fascinating history behind it. And I think that while it's less true now, usually I would say that there's not going to be too many people who are going to die on the hill of flat earthism, even though it embodies a lot of the qualities that attend to these other set pieces like Galileo or the Scopes trial. That's less true today because strangely enough, there are more flat earthers out there. But the flat earth, as an example, for me, it really embodied all of the themes that I was trying to touch on in my book. There's misunderstood history, in the sense that actually no Christian believed in a flat earth. And certainly it was never a point of orthodoxy. We have about 5 authors throughout the entire course of Christian history who held to a flat earth. And except for about 2 of them, no one's really dogmatic about it. And it wasn't until the 19th century that flat earthism really started arising again. And again, this was in response to the professionalization debates, because there was a real sense that the new profession of scientist was a very elite discipline, a discipline that was taking away the common man's ability to believe that they could understand the world based on sort of their everyday common sense observations of it. Now you had to have this complicated set of practices that unearthed this evolutionary history, and the flat Earth really became a counter movement to that type of elitist knowledge. They kind of titled themselves as, in the line of Francis Bacon, the idea that science is really common sense rigorously applied. And we often believe that, but in the history of science, that's not the case at all. In fact, science is often, it advances based on very counterintuitive examples. I mean, quantum physics today is probably, the best example of that. But the rebuttal that, no one was there to see evolution, that was a complaint that was there from the beginning, because it was really part and parcel of this common man, common sense ability to perceive the world versus this set of elite technologies that were, kind of grooming our understanding to truly see the world. So for me, set pieces like the flat Earth are very helpful because they, for the most part, are non-controversial for most people, and they also allow an entrance point that touches kind of the back door of a lot of these other issues. The sense that theology was sort of deleted from history, and that there's actually another way we can tell history, where Christianity plays a complex part, not necessarily purely positive, but certainly a much more active role in creating these concepts of cause and effect and space and time, etc. And I think that there's just, for me, these more robust histories are just so much more interesting than kind of these cookie cutter binaries that we tend to get foisted upon us. And so for me, this sort of overturning mythological history, at least for me, has been very pedagogically successful, because it does really provide that backdoor past a lot of the stuff that just shuts down conversations immediately.
So scientific concordism is the idea that the Bible is written to include specific information that concords with our current modern science of our day. And I think that's part of the conflict that we see in current day with the science and faith and theology. And so what's wrong with this idea that the Bible contains or points to modern, our day science?
Yeah. I want to be careful here, because I mean, there, perhaps there is a scientific truth or two hidden in there. And as a presupposition, I don't want to rule that out. If someone could demonstrate that, then I guess more power to them. To me, part of the difficulty here for me is that it's just so not obvious that the Bible would be a scientific textbook at all, that I'm sometimes taken aback by how much that has become part of the vocabulary of our culture. But I think, again, part of the story of deleting theology, and the great question that you asked earlier about, are there certain Christian sectors that have sort of implicitly or explicitly taken on board some of this mythology and sort of run with it as if it's God's truth that we sort of have to work with? And I think one of the unfortunate side effects of this is, with the rise of the more positivistic interpretations of science, because I think it's important to stress positivism isn't science full stop. It's a philosophical interpretation of science, that a lot of Christians actually kind of took that on board. And when you do that, all of a sudden Scripture becomes not full of imagery and metaphor, nor is it primarily theological. It becomes, a positivist history text or a positivist scientific text. And that type of concordism is not part of the Christian tradition until really 200 years ago, or more or less. I mean, you could probably always find this or that source at any given time that wants to argue that it proves this or that, quote unquote pagan idea. But, if one reads Thomas Aquinas or Augustine, it's a very complex mediation that one goes through before Scripture touches upon the world in an interpretive way. And this sort of one-to-one idea of concordism, it really, it's not maintaining the Christian tradition. It's really maintaining a very peculiar and time-bound mutation of it that arose in the 19th century. Kind of is, it's not, it's the other side of the coin of certain strands of positivistic Darwinism or positivistic sciences. And so to me, I think one of the very helpful things is approaching the richness of the Christian tradition and realizing that the last 200 years of Victorian Christianity is in many ways, it's given us a lot of great stuff, but it's also in many ways an aberration that has really narrowed and rigidified. That's not really a word, but it's really narrowed our idea of what Christianity is, of what Scripture is, and how that relates to the world. And I think that we've really created a very damaging false set of dilemmas here. If Thomas Aquinas we brought him into our time today, I think he'd be really scratching his head at the idea that Scripture somehow can directly intervene into our understanding of nature or creation. All of these are, very historically and philosophically complex topics. And there are, there's a host of translations between these different areas of understanding, theology, philosophy, history, before we can say that the Bible touches down into our understanding of nature, or vice versa. And I think we're much richer for that, So yeah, I think it's really coming to realize how much we're kind of prisoners of a recent past for a lot of these things.
All right. So I'm just thinking, we stand on this hill of all of our past history, and so much of it is hidden under the surface, and we really only know about the most visible parts, unless we dig a lot. So where do you think we stand as let's stick primarily with American culture, on the either the conflict or warfare between science and faith, or maybe more of an integration path going forward? Where are we now, and what do you see as the path that's going to come out of our time, of our day and age going forward?
Yeah, that's a huge question. For my part, I don't want to punt here. Since I'm not a scientist, I always hesitate to talk about that type of integration, because I think that I think one of the real troubles is that we tend to treat science as if it's this one singular homogeneous category. And I think that, and similarly with theology, as primarily a theologian, I can attest to the fact that theology it gets complex, and the rabbit trail goes about as far as you want to take it. And I think the sciences are very much the same way. I think the way forward is more of an ad hoc approach. I think certainly we can, try for things like systematic theology, but with the understanding that theology is going to have a different relationship with astrophysics than it will to evolutionary theory, or than it will to history. And I think that one of the major problems in the fundamentalist modernist issue was the attempt to kind of use these large scale categories as touching upon everything. And that was really a problem, especially because many fundamentalists, again, they sort of imbibed a very positivist, anti-metaphysical approach that I don't think is very conducive to a theistic worldview. And, a lot of them were kind of convinced that Christians could just do that better. And I think that this really jettisoned a lot of the very rich and robust theological and metaphysical heritage of Christianity. So I think the way forward is, T.F. Torrance is a very famous English-speaking theologian, and he had this idea of the all sciences and theology. He treated theology as a science, are shaped based upon the object of their inquiry. And without commenting on the validity, I think that that's at least helpful for us to keep in mind that we're not here to provide unilateral solutions. We're here to, talk about God's very complex and intricate world. And so that means that we're going to have to embrace humility, in the sense that we can't provide these sort of omnicompetent stories anymore. And we're going to have to, I think, live with some of the tension of the fact that theology is going to be related differently to different sciences. So, that's kind of a non-answer in a certain way. But I think certainly humility is a huge part of it. And for my part, historical re-education, because I think that there's this huge fear that anything other than the fundamentalist six-day creationist option is kind of a capitulation to the enemy. When in fact, the richness of Christian history, there's not very much new that happens in terms of options when Darwinism arrives on the scene. I mean, that's kind of itself a myth that's been perpetuated, that Darwin came and sort of overturned the playground of the theologians. And certainly there were some who had very vociferous, vocal reactions to Darwinism. But in terms of interpretive options for the Bible, different theological ideas, there wasn't much new necessarily that came on the table. And I think embracing the richness of our past is going to help us kind of move into a more intricate and nuanced future. Or I hope.
Well, I think the idea of humility is really important, and it needs to apply not just to scientists, but to theologians and the people who don't have a strong background, maybe in either discipline. But I also think we need to be really careful. There are some things that are known pretty well, and taking on a false humility that possibly will be wrong on that. I don't think that does us a service either, because we live in a real world that has real attributes and real things about it. And we're not going to make some discovery tomorrow to find out that really Ptolemy was correct and the Earth really is the center. I mean, that's just not going to happen. So there's this balance between humility, and then there's also this, we do have to wrestle with reality.
I think that's absolutely true. And there's I think a real sense in which I think that at some point playing nice is giving in to false opinions, and Christianity is about the truth, and I don't think we should fear the truth, but the truth can hurt sometimes, but again, for me, the historical angle is just so appealing because it can really cause disequilibrium, but I think that it's so fruitful sometimes, because for me, it's just like, I'm constantly amazed at what I thought I knew. And while sometimes learning new things can be disturbing, I think that that's part of the growth process that God has intended for us. I think that the historical angle for me has really opened my horizons. I mean, if you look at the fundamentals, the set of books that, created the name of fundamentalism, there were several evolutionists as part of that series, So it's really interesting that even the rigid anti-evolutionist fundamentalism that we know today, that's really a Scopes post-Scopes phenomenon. Even that doesn't even exist in the 19th century, So again, for me, understanding how much I was imprisoned by sort of a false sense of history and kind of imprisoned by a recent past that I didn't know about, it's been really liberating to kind of to peer into that and see that we're not alone here, and we don't have to, I think, pledge a false allegiance. There's a lot of richness out there to be sought, and I think that you're absolutely right. I think that we can be on the side of truth, and we don't have to fear that that's going to overturn our faith or anything of the sort.
Excuse me, Derrick, we have to have you on again, because there's just, it's like trying to do Lord of the Rings in 2 episodes. We just can't.
Oh, I would love to. Yeah, anytime.
We can't do justice to it. I'd love to maybe even do a whole episode on Scopes, but
absolutely.
I don't want to keep you much longer, because we've gotten you for an hour and a half already. So this might be an unfair question to ask, but I'm going to ask
Go for it.
And that is, Kristine and I spend a lot of time studying and looking at modern polls that show a couple of generations now, including not just the millennials, but Generation Z, are fleeing the church, not coming back. And one of the reasons they give in their top 5 issues is related to science. And so my question to you basically is going to be, did Huxley win? If that's perception today. But I want to phrase it in this way. You began this discussion with us by talking about how in your church, as a young kindergarten first grader, there was that dichotomy between T-Rex bunking with Noah on the ark and your understanding of reality. How did you navigate that? Because there's a famous YouTuber, Paul Enns, who's famously known as Paul Ogia, who the dinosaur issue tripped him up, and he ended up leaving the faith over the dinosaur issue. And yet you have navigated it, and you clearly have a strong, devoted faith, and yet you realize growing up as a young Earth creationist, how did you navigate that without bitterness or resentment, or without walking away from the whole faith? So I know I've gotten personal here at the end, but I wonder if you could take a look at that question and then maybe wrap it up by letting us know if you think that Huxley's actually won the argument outside of academic circles. I think the understanding is that faith and science had a hot war, and that science won. But
no, I think it's completely appropriate to end on a more personal question. I don't know if there was a formula, or anything of the sort that I followed. I think for one thing, for me, for better or worse, even as a kid reading scripture, it just never really occurred to me that it was giving us some sort of rigorous timeline. And so, it's perhaps this isn't quite the answer that I should give. Initially, maybe it was just a sense of non-rigorousness, of not thinking that scripture was, to be applied that way. But I think that evolved into a very true answer, and scripture is not a scientific textbook, nor are theological pronouncements scientific pronouncements. They're not directly translatable into one another. And I think that one of the major fallouts that happened again is ironically not the warfare between science and Christianity, but their illicit fusion at key points that often made it so that a theological vocabulary was assumed to be a scientific vocabulary, perhaps simply using other terms. So Richard Dawkins says that, God is a scientific theory, and he's happy to treat it that way. And he says that, theologians have always used God that way. It's the failed scientific hypothesis, right? I think that this fusion, or the variety of fusions that have occurred between theology and science, are precisely what have been so destructive, because not only have they, I think, failed, because I don't think that theology was ever meant to be that type of direct scientific discourse. They're doing things at different levels, different interconnected strata, of how we view the world and how we describe it. But it's also caused a historical disconnect in the sense that, these answers failed, and that's how we think the church has always done it. And so these fusions have really destroyed the nuanced variety of a theological and metaphysical and philosophical vocabulary that is not science by other means. Because science, I think, we often tend to default that is the only legitimate type of explanation in the world. And while we don't have time to get into it, that's simply not the case. And for me, part of what helped me going forward is just the understanding that, again, science is its own domain. And as soon as science is making pronouncements about religion or about the world at large, it's actually not science anymore. It's science plus philosophy. It's philosophy that might be using science as a set of, premises or data or something like that. And for me, especially in the last, decade or so, I've come to realize more and more how much that is really the case. And the fusions between science and theology that occurred, I think, really caused a complete collapse of a sophisticated theological vocabulary. There's a medieval philosopher, expert on medieval philosophy and theology, Etienne Gilson, and he has this great line. He says that scholastic theology died when it began mistaking its own pronouncements for science. And And I think that what we have to do is we have to come back and understand that theological and scientific pronouncements are working on different levels, perhaps complementary levels, but certainly different levels of what they're doing. And the idea that theology or that God and science are in the same realm and that they are competing in a zero-sum game for, explanatory elbow room. Historically, something has gone catastrophically wrong, because that is not how theologians like Thomas Aquinas or even John Calvin, did things. And so again, for me, understanding that this isn't Christianity full stop that's being attacked. It's a very specific form, often a very Americanized form of Christianity, a very positivist form of Christianity, as is sometimes the case. That is being attacked. And I think in a weird roundabout way, we can actually be thankful for that, because like Luther said, we're often a factory for creating idols. And if science is knocking down these images of God, we can be fairly certain that they were never the true God. I think that this is, we can, use this to help us understand that actually God is bigger and better than any of the images that we may previously have had of him. So I don't know if that's quite the answer that is reproducible for other people, but for me, just historically speaking, if science has attacked God, I think it sort of stepped out of the box of science. And I also think that picture of God, I think we can just be happy that it got tossed out, because it wasn't God. I don't think God is going to be, he isn't a failed explanation. He's not the gap filler. He never was until the Victorian period. So, for me, really realizing how much, again, we've become captives of a recent past, and that Christianity and that Christ is so much more than that. And that this is kind of part of our pilgrimage, our journey is kind of discovering that, has really kept me going. I don't have all the answers. So.
If you could go back in time and witness any historical event, what would you want to go see?
That is such a good question. There's always, I think, the litany of the Christian answers, like, could I be in the tomb when Christ resurrected? Honestly, the supernaturalist in me, I would love to just be in Roswell, New Mexico, and kind of resolve that mystery. Was it aliens? Was it just a weather balloon? What was going on there? I'm always really into trying to unravel those types of mysteries. So I think I go with the kind of a nerdy answer here. I'd love to be at Roswell, or something like the Tunguska event that exploded a bunch of trees in Russia, assuming I could survive if I was, answer. But
Wow.
I think that would be my answer there.
That's an X-Files
Something in
answer.
the Bermuda Triangle.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Bermuda Triangle stuff. Assuming I can make it back and, not be an experiment or something.
Yeah.